Hello, I'm Stuart Pallister. After working as a journalist and editor in Asia for more than a decade, I switched to higher education, working in research communications for business schools like INSEAD in Singapore and the National University of Singapore. So welcome to Leading Hospitality Through Turbulent Times. The series is entitled The World After 2020. We're now into part 2. This session will be a presentation of about an hour, and we'll have something like 30 minutes for questions. So we'll take some after about half an hour and the remaining questions at the end of the session. We will be taking questions, written questions only, and you can submit these as we go along. And before we start, just a reminder once again that the session will be recorded and will be available on the Moodle platform afterwards. So without further ado, I'll hand over now to Professor Yves Schemeil, who specializes in global and comparative politics. Professor Schemeil.
Oh, thank you, Stuart. Welcome back to everyone, and welcome for those who attend this course for the first time. And just try to say a few sentences about what we have learned so far. First, instability has always been the rule in international relations. It's going to be that way, whatever the efforts to stabilize the world are, and they are increasingly mattering for the whole system. There are inventions, etc. Among these inventions or innovations, the international organizations are very effective, more and more effective, whereas some can be criticized, of course, in times of turbulence, like the WHO by now with this COVID-19 issue and the way it addressed it. But in the long run, it makes a great difference to organize diplomacy and focus diplomacy on the international organizations, the multilateral negotiations, etc., than sticking to the old confrontation between states and the old classical diplomacies. This is where we are today, and we are going to explore this in the shortest period of time we can. What kind of lesson we can draw from the coronavirus crisis? And can we try to escape the type of challenges that appear from time to time and are quite unexpected? Well, you know, the problem is that we are, of course, trying to understand what the world is surrounding us, but our brain, which is very magnificent machine, is nonetheless under some stress when trying to know the world, know the outside world, whatever outside us, what we see, and that's what the psychologists call cognition is an issue. Why? Well, you know, it's not easy to draw lessons from the past. We see that policymakers are always repeating the same errors and mistakes in the long run, and we should ask, of course, we would ask why they don't draw lessons from the past, but they don't do that for various reasons. Because, for example, they can misinterpret the facts, thinking that we are in such a type of context instead of another one. That's not reality. It's the way we perceive reality. We can have a bad memory of what happened in the past and just change or make this the retrieval of our memory partial and in a way more ideological, possibly than objective. And there are logical shortcuts. I mean, we want to reach a decision as soon as possible. We don't want to lose too much time making arguments and counter arguments, etc. And all that means that we just keep quite a number of things which are just in front of our very eyes, but we don't see them, because if we did, then we were completely paralyzed. So that's basically what the brain does when it wants to know the outside world. Cognition weighs also on collaboration between people, because to collaborate, you need to have some trust in the others. And the problem is that the more the others are strangers or foreigners and far away from you, and of different identity, etc. And the worse it is in terms of being the propensity to collaborate. There are risks of misunderstandings, of course. In everyday life, it's also the case. We all experience this nearly every day. But there are also misperceptions, which means that we think that we know for sure something, but actually we don't. And this is called a cognitive bias. Why are we suffering from a number of cognitive biases? It's because the brain is what has been called a cognitive miser, which means that the brain is sparing time, effort, and of course energy, which means the blood which goes to the brain and has to be dragged from every other muscles or whatever in order to help you think. So the brain does exactly what is needed and nothing more. So if it reaches its end, which is, for example, I see at the outside, I see it's a fair day today, that's enough. I'm not worrying about some clouds. I'm not worrying about it's not the time of the year where this weather should be fair like this. And I'm not looking for certainly a recension or a list of events, catastrophic events where the fair weather like this was the sign of a disaster coming from, for example, a hurricane. So the cognitive biases there are a number of cognitive biases. I'm going to go as far as possible into the list. First, groupthink, meaning that if you put people together in a room for a while, they are cut off from the outside, and they have to find out a solution, and then first of all decide what's happening and how we could react to this. What's happening? Exactly what we have now with the COVID-19. What is it exactly? How damaging it is for the human being on the one hand, from the economy on the other hand, and then we have to make a decision. So if you lock these people down from a period of time, what will happen is that they will have a spirit of belonging to the same group, which is in a way pleasant. They won't like to be the person to whom the other would assign the responsibility of breaking the group into parts and making this discussion, putting an end to this discussion, because there will be dissent. So if you don't want to be the dissenting one, the one by whom the group is going to be disbanded, then and if you think that you are the only one to be dissenting, because the other don't express their views openly, so each one thinks that, oh, I'm alone thinking that is not the good solution, but the others seem to be quite agreeing on the solution, which eventually will come out from the discussion. So I rally this solution, and everyone, or nearly everyone, think that it's a wrong solution. So that's one problem when we are trying to examine what's happening outside. There is a G7 meeting in Washington next month, early June, and we are not completely sure that the heads of state and government who are a member of the G7 are not going to look at the COVID-19 crisis this way. That's a possibility. Well, you can also rely on some characters like Trump to express their dissent openly compared to the usual situation of groupthink. There also are pre-existing worldviews. Now, we are used to see the world in some way. We have our own interpretation of what happened or what could happen. And this is called a cognitive frame. That means that it's like a frame, with a painting or a photograph. I mean, you don't see what is on the outside of the frame. But there are many things which matter, which are outside of the frame. And one of the examples is that you see something happening and you try to make sense of it, retrieving in your memory something which looks like in the past, sometimes very far past. And then you say, okay, I understand. It's like, and so on. For example, If you see the COVID crisis at the very beginning, you see, oh, it's like the SARS-1 viewed from Europe. SARS-1 was not at all a problem in Europe, although we had great fears that it would become a problem in 2003. It did not. So when in 2019 and early 20, we have this SARS-2, so that's another official name of the COVID-19, we think that it's simply, it will simply be the same thing. An influenza, very, very limited influenza with very, very limited casualties, which was not the case. There is also irrational thinking. That's one of my favorites. First, wishful thinking. We like the world to be this or that, and so we are doing exactly as if it was the case, which is not. But dirty thinking is very interesting. That means that you know that it's not the correct way to make a judgment, but you prefer this way to assess something than the correct, more logical way. For example, if you like lobsters, then you stick to the idea that lobsters have no central nervous system, so they don't suffer when you just throw them into boiling water, in which probably they will need minutes to die in terrible sufferances. But we like lobsters, so we think that, no, they don't suffer. And of course, we know that it's not completely correct, but we are not going to be stopped by this because our taste for lobsters is higher than our sense of logic. And there is also post hoc or after the fact reasoning. So you did things for some reasons, and then once they have been done, you give another reason for for your deeds, for your opinions, or whatsoever. So you rebuild history. This is what is done in the novel 1984 all the time. So states change alliance, and so the history books, textbooks are redrafted. And there is also the question, which is very important in the COVID-19 crisis, of underestimates, because we are dealing with large number of people who are going to be affected or who will just die from the COVID-19 worldwide. And so it's much beyond our capability to predict how many people who will be the victims of COVID-19. So we completely underestimate what could happen. And then, of course, the decisions we make about how to prevent the pandemic are weakened by these underestimates. This is particularly true with exponential curves. Here is a figure. I'll leave you time when you want to look at it in detail, but the blue line is an average consensus among medical scholars in the United States about the number of people who would be affected when they were interviewed in on March 29, and then this is the figure very soon after that, and we know that by now it's even higher, with nearly 90,000 people dead. Irrational thinking is also overconfidence in one's capacity. So we, for example, can think that because we are at the head of a hotel company, which has a lot of reputation, which is a very deeply rooted one in many countries, and some sort of a historical landmark somewhere, etc. So we are not going to be impacted by a pandemic. We know how to react. We already did in the past. We can think that because we have a good social security system and a good health system compared to other countries, then we will not be impacted as they are. Probably the Germans think that they are not going to be impacted as much as they already are or would be if things went wrong, as Spain, for example, or Italy. And then that is leading to some conformism and temptation to imitate other people. I mean, if other people don't wear masks in the street after the lockdown, why should I? There is also something which is called affective intelligence, which means that we don't have mere reasoning on the basis of logic only. We always mix some emotions with our logic, so we cannot rely on our conclusions because they are not purely cognitive conclusions. They are also emotional. Irrational choice prevail, actually, even among top decision makers, and that means that is something that you should be aware of, and you should be prepared to make your own personal check up and saying and asking if you really did make the right decision and the correct decision, instead of just doing things that settle the issue for the moment and that makes you relieved for a while. So that's something we should ask all the time. Are we logical, or just we illogical? So most of the people can just be considerate. They have a considerate type of reasoning, but it's not fully rational. A very famous scholar called Herbert Simon said, we are living with bounded rationality. It's not full rationality, it's rationality which is constrained by quite a number of events in the environment. And so basically, when we make a decision, like opening a restaurant in the wake of the COVID crisis, too early or too late, etc., or hotel, then we should maximize the utility of the decision in terms of benefit, costs, risk, opportunities, etc., as you all know. SWOT analysis, but actually most of the time you have to be satisfied with the solution, which is a reflect of the self-esteem you have, of the reputation you have, of the feeling that you have. It's always, something which is really thin and which relies on science, on perceptions, doesn't rely on sound reasoning. So diplomacy has been invented to get out of such cognitive traps and help diplomats to work together on deciding what the situation is exactly, what the risks are, what the threats could be, and how we could get out of all this and find a way to make peace. Diplomacy is a buffer against hasty and hazardous decisions, which could be made just because on top of the head and just because there is something which is really annoying for someone, and then you react in a quarter of a second. It buys time, and so it's important to take the time needed to reconsidering the fact several times before making a decision on the basis of this pseudo or so-called facts. And so diplomacy is also about making consensus out of dissenting opinions, which is quite an alchemy, quite an achievement, actually. Why is it so? Because if you look at diplomats or people who are in international meetings of the Association of Hotels and Restaurants, for example, and try to find a consensus of what they should do about reopening their business once the COVID crisis is behind them or nearly behind them, and so at what time exactly they should do what for which kind of audience or customers, etc. So you see that there are multiple angles to see a problem, and there are multiple ways to solve this problem. That's what multilateral means, actually. You have all angles and ways, and so we have to combine this, and diplomacy is about multilateral things. But classical diplomacy did not know exactly what multilateralism meant. It became very normal in international relations rather recently, actually more or less after 1945. But they behaved exactly as if they had known what multilateral meant. So let's start with the invention of diplomacy and see how it led to consider that addressing a crisis, a world crisis or a regional crisis, together would be better than going alone. Getting along with others would always be better than going alone. So classical diplomacy, first of all, physical presence matters. People are face to face. They can look at each other. It's very important to understand what's happening when you see the face of someone, and you can just make projections about his or her feelings. And that's what the people who are in the front stage can do, but there are also people who are backstage and help them understand what's happening, recap what has happened so far, make proposals for the new round of discussion, etc. Diplomats are also mandated by political decision makers in their country. They receive instructions, but they have some room for maneuver according to the context and to the conjuncture, which all in all prevents hasty decisions. So that's the important point. No hasty decision. And that applies to the business as well. I mean, especially hospitality business. You must have time to have second thoughts about something and to reconsider your decision and to be your own self-critic. In classical diplomacy, contrary to a number of other things, but probably not to meetings of people who are in a business, whatever the business is, for example, air transportation, decorum matters. Decorum means that, you are going to receive people in a certain venue with a lot of consideration for their status. There will be ways to accommodate them and give them the sense of their own importance, etc. And sometimes it's really ceremonial, so you make too much out of it. And probably by now, the COVID crisis is showing that quite a number of such meetings are not absolutely necessary, that you can go online as we do now, and that would settle the issue as well. The negotiation process in classical diplomacy is slow. You take your time. And it's also iterative. That means that it's not one shot. You have successive rounds. So whatever you promise today, the type of allies you find, you are going to be yourself in the same situation, but in another context in the next round, and so on and so forth. So you have to be moderate, not to transform someone who could be an ally into an enemy in the long run. It is confidential. Well, as Stuart say, if you have a smartphone somewhere, there are leakages, and you can have even records of things which should be discreet. But most of the time, in classical times of diplomacy, at least before 1945, and certainly before 2016, yes, time of the mushrooming of the internet connections. It will remain that way. No victory is expected. There are no winners. I mean, everyone is supposed to win or not to lose too much. So that's what compromise is. So diplomacy is about finding compromises where people actually have interests which are not compatible, and you need to have a whole process to reach that end. Multilateral diplomacy is based on the fact that many states are invited to diplomatic talks, not several states. In the 17th century, I mean, there were something like a dozen states at the maximum represented by diplomats who negotiated. But now there are 190, 140, and each is supposed to be on an equal footing with his peers. I mean, if you are the representative of Fiji, then you are as important as the representative of the United States. That's the theory. So you have to make common rules together and then act according to these rules. There are commitments. So you commit to rules and then you enforce the rules. To reach this end, you are alternating between closed sessions and plenaries. So you need closed sessions where things remain confidential and are off. And then you need plenaries to put on paper the type of agreement that was reached and make it public. So then you have press releases and you reach a larger audience, but this is done step by step in a piecemeal way. again, it's all about discretion, confidentiality, time, and the necessity to reconsider things several times. So here I leave you read this on your own. It's about the whole process, which starts with raising an issue and then finding a solution, because this is important to understand how much stakeholders must be involved at each stage in order to reach a common resolution. So it's a cooperative game. It's not a competitive game. A war is a competitive game, but diplomacy is a cooperative game, and especially multilateral diplomacy, the type of diplomacy we have by now. The golden rule is doing as you would be done by. Doing as you would be done by. Well, you don't want others to do things that you should not like to suffer from. And then if there are partners who do not respect these rules, then let's make rooms to a sort of unilateral diplomacy, which is a contradiction in term actually. But if you look at people like Trump or Boris Johnson, you see that this makes sense for some major figures, characters like them. Unilateral diplomacy used a new kind of language, which was called carnivorous by an expert. And you know, it's brutal, coarse. There is a lot of egoism, and distrust, of course, is prominent. And so there are a number of people who think that diplomats are like warriors, and sometimes they are warriors. Also, they are wolf warriors. We see. Yeah. Now, the interesting thing about multilateralism, invented after classical diplomacy with hundreds of years of experience, is that it resists in a number of situations in which just being confronted to people who use force against the other cannot work. And I have particularly chosen this example, which is an example which has an impact on hospitality, which is the plastic waste crisis. Because this is long-lasting, much longer than the viruses actually. It's going to last for hundreds of years, possibly. So if multilateral negotiations are due to protect the commons, the global public goods, remember our first session, our two first sessions, the global public goods that could not be produced by other stakeholders than states acting together into international organizations. Within international organization, the case of the plastic waste is rather telling. And it's addressed actually by a number of organizations and is also under the coverage of a number of treaties and international conventions. Look at this map. As you see, this is the plastic continent, actually, and here on the map, the sources of this disaster are identified, but it's there, and it's going to be probably even worse in the next decade. So you need a collaborative order, and you can review this cooperative units and bodies when we are finished with this session. And so you need cluster of international organization in a specific field like plastic waste. They can be very effective. Why? Because they are looking for what is called now the ESM, an environmentally sound management of plastic waste. It's a global norm, which is actually respected by any country in the world, and by any other stakeholders, NGOs, business corporations, business associations, etc. And everyone has to pay due respect to this norm when a decision is made about anything like, again, reopening a hotel or whatsoever. I mean, you should ask what kind of plastic you are going to littering, how much litter of plastic is going to be thrown out on beaches, etc. These are the treaties and conventions which make it a norm, a worldwide norm, and you read this later on, the practical consequences on hospitality is that this new norm has a sub-norm, which is that you have to sort waste and recycle it. And that is, of course, an additional constraint for hospitality business. It takes time, it requires money, you have to have people who are paid for doing this, and it's always increasing. And the number of things that you have to sort out, the list is increasing year after year. And that norms, of course, has an impact on the business model of people who are in hospitality. And here you see probably the maximum in Japan. To my memory, there are no other country in which more trying to sort out things are in place everywhere, including universities, for example, hospitals, etc. The practical consequences also are pollution. And so someone will have to pay the cost of cleaning, because you can argue that whatever is on your beach, if you are a private resort somewhere, a luxury private resort in an island, a tropical island, etc., that you did not bring this plastic waste on your beach, you just evacuated, but you have to pay for the evacuation. And also you would like someone to pay for not wasting too much plastic littering, and having this type of consequences. And more so if you are near World Heritage landmarks, etc. The practical consequences are, manifold, and let me leave you with this. And the problem is that what kind of decision we can make? Well, each decision has advantages and inconveniences, benefits and costs. We have to decide, for example, that the priority is the planet, or it's the economic development of countries in which the plastic industry is important, or the oil industry is important, because plastic is made out of oil. So oil-producing countries or exporting countries are very much concerned with the fact that plastic continue to be produced, and that the need for plastic is going to increase, not decrease. That means that in the long run, you have to make an option and privilege some countries in the world. Yes, Stuart?
Yeah, sorry, my phone was buzzing there.
Okay, I'm just finishing this, can I?
Yeah, sure, yeah.
Okay, so markets cannot make such arbitrage between contradictory interpretation of the norm, and they cannot privilege automatically some producers against the others, and so the lobbying they make to get some smoothing of the norms for their own business, etc., cannot be completely effective. And even the World Economic Forum in Davos, the richest countries of the world, and in one of the richest countries in the world, decided on this several times, because they know that industry and business will resist top-down reforms, advocate for self-regulation. So we will commit ourselves to the idea that we are doing whatever we can to avoid littering beaches with plastic, and the oceans and the seas, etc. But that's not enough. That's not enough, and international organization must be brought in, because these decisions are difficult to make, and eventually only organizations such as the WTO will have enough power to make the countries in the world and the states, governments, enforce this rule. And this is an example of what is already happening by now, because before next month, this initiative on plastic pollution may become a prominent commitment at world level. And that would be the first time. So the WTO can be of some help for that. And of course, this works for some areas of activities, in which you can put hospitality, actually, because hospitality is not completely about security, about safety, or about international crisis, etc. War and civil war. In that there's other realms, it's clear that international organizations are lacking power. But in the sector in which you are, they matter. Yes, Stuart. Do we have questions?
Yeah, I thought that was an interesting example about plastic pollution, especially as climate change and so on has been brought into sharp focus, sharp relief due to the crisis, and we're seeing, we're seeing blue skies, having cleaner air. So it will be a question of how far we can go in terms of acting together and collaborating together to protect the environment and to protect wildlife, because of the impact of pollution, plastic pollution.
Okay, if you go back,
it involves bringing together NGOs, governments to take action within their own countries and so on, as well as at an international level with the intergovernmental organizations. Yeah,
you see, the problem is that plastic cross borders, and it's an externality. It's something that comes from one country and then reaches other countries, and nobody knows exactly how to prevent this and how to make the emitting country pays for the pollution. And at some point, you don't even know where it comes from, because it has been mixed on the ocean, in the middle of the ocean, and it's like some sort of a new island of plastic, and you don't know where the plastic composing this island come from. So at that point, you need to go to cross-border organizations like the WTO, which is exactly this, and the World Customs Organization that we already mentioned, etc. And also, if it's about the safety and the cleanliness of beaches, for example, you may have a resolution at the level of the World Tourism Organization that we met last time, which can intervene and say something about, if you want to have clean beaches, then the main thing you have is to sort out the plastic litter before it is thrown out into the ocean. Then you should have probably lobby in your own country, if it doesn't exist, to have regulations about sorting out and recycling. Then you need an industry to recycle the plastic. And then also you can think that there are, as in the slide I didn't look like, I didn't comment actually. This one, there's two ones, but there are alternatives to plastic. All, of course, have raised problems. There is nothing perfect, but there are alternatives to plastics, and you can actually use plastic for some purposes and not for others. For example, protective wear in hospitals by now are made of plastic. Masks are made of plastic. So in this case, it's obvious that we need this kind of plastic. But do we need a mineral border of plastic? That's another issue. And believe me, mineral water are actually a great bulk of the plastic continent lost in the ocean, for sure. So my answer is that we should be optimistic about the fact that everything which is really cross-border and nobody can actually control has to be controlled by an international organization and will be in the future. Now, the other side of the argument is that once this universal norm has been made by an international organization and is accepted, at least seems to be accepted by the spokesperson of any country in any type of venue, then the problem is that it might have a great impact on the business of anyone. Hospitality business, for example, you have norms about handicaps, about fire exit. you have additional norms. Each time you have a new committee about the security, for example, of people who can be evacuated from a hotel in any circumstances, be it fire, be it tsunami, be it terrorism, etc. Then of course you have additional norms. This norm has to be implemented, and implementation becomes part of the agenda of people who are running hotels and restaurants anywhere, because they have to comply with the rule. They also have to pay the cost of doing this, and so in the end, it's an additional burden on their, I would say, on their debt or on their expenses. And so there is nothing which works quite well and which is satisfying for everyone, for sure. But in the long run, it's better to have constraining norms which take a heavy toll on profits than just to disappear.
Okay, we have one question on the Q&A, but we'll perhaps come back to that at the end, because it's about whether the crisis will change the way that people are doing business. Perhaps just quickly, though, to touch upon the idea of classical diplomacy, and that to avoid making hasty decisions. We're living in a world where the President of the United States is basically taking knee-jerk decisions all the time, and then sending out his decisions via Twitter and bypassing all the diplomats and the official channels.
That's right. Well, I come back to it in 10 minutes, I guess.
Okay, good.
That's on my agenda. Exactly, you're right. It's a good question. Okay,
so I think maybe if you'd like to continue, and then we'll round up in 10, 15 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Stuart. I'll continue. Okay, now, here you have to consider the fact that diplomacy has one main priority, which is to put an end to conflicts which are on the list of intractable conflicts. That means that so far nobody ever succeeded in solving them, and it lasted for decades or sometimes centuries. How this relates to you as people who are having a job in the hospitality business? Well, you may have to live wherever you are with an intractable conflict near you. If you are in Syria, Palestine, Lebanon, Jordan, for example, and Israel, then the intractable conflict is there, and that doesn't prevent you to open hotels and restaurants, to have travel and tourism organized, tours organized, etc. So, but it's important to understand that these conflicts are going to be there for a long period of time, again and again, but that you can live with them. And so it's important to find out if they can be solved also as well, and there will be new opportunity when they are solved. Intractable conflict are, when the resolution is unlikely, when the successive rounds of negotiations have failed, when the peace agreements are always provisional and partial and doomed to fail, actually. Mutual trust persists long after distrust, sorry. That's wishful thinking. Mutual distrust persists long after ceasefires are declared, and so you can just live together without being actually in peace. I give you here a list of examples, and you can add others as well. And when you want to reach a peaceful settlement to an intractable conflict, you need to have something which is a package deal, which means every type of issue related to this conflict is simultaneously solved. It's what's called in diplomatic language a Christmas tree. So you put a number of gifts, and everyone in the family is happy with the gift. Exactly like the Clinton 2000 plan for Palestine, or we don't know yet, but although there are many doubts, the Trump 2009 plan. This a number of times you cannot reach this before a long process of discussion where people confess their crimes and other people forgive them or just recognize that the situation was such that they were not completely as human as they should have been at the time, etc. And so what this being done, and now you can go on and resume business as usual. And of course, most of the time also you have to reconstruct a whole country, rebuild the whole country in many aspects, political, economical, urban, etc. And some political systems are completely redesigned, like was the case, as was the case with Japan and Germany after 1945. So you see, to reach this type of conflict resolution at the end of an intractable conflict is much beyond our control, and probably these conflicts are going to last. So when there is a window of opportunity to put an end to such conflicts, it's because the mediation process work. There are countries which have a reputation in the world of being great pacemakers. They help the others to get along together, discuss face-to-face, have a series of rounds of negotiations behind closed doors and then in front of a larger audience. And this is when your country, the country in which you are having your business in the field of hospitality, is on the list of this peacemaker, it's a great advantage. So, for example, Switzerland, Norway, and Ireland at some point, and others are countries which got this reputation. Even in the old past, Romania, possibly it could come back to such a reputation in the next decade. Egypt within the Arab world, this reputation of being a peacemaker, having a lot of people who are able to make a good mediation, helps a lot to be attractive for people who come from the outside, and even if they just come for peace conferences, for example, of course. Well, my conclusion for you is that you have to live with intractable conflict. If you are in India near the Kashmir boundary, well, you know that it's an intractable conflict. It's not going to be solved. If you are in Jericho, whatever will happen to this region and this part of Israel and Palestine, well, you have to do with it, and you cannot change the context. And so you have to learn to live dangerously. Living dangerously means that you have to adopt a concept which is granular. Granular concept. The granular concept means that if you have a mind, a cognitive mind of your environment, then you have to look for spots where stability is long-lasting and probably resilient. I'll give you an example in the next slide, which is here the Chernobyl impact of the accident of the nuclear plant there. As you see, there are parts of Belarus and even Russia where you can pick up mushrooms in the forests without any problem, and there are other parts where you cannot. You just cannot. So I remember a diplomat in Minsk once who told me that you can eat my mushrooms because I picked them myself, according to, after having looked at the latest map drawn by the French experts who were in charge of depolluting the region of its nuclear toxics, and I was not completely confident in the non-toxicity of his mushrooms, so I didn't eat them. That's not a good example for hospitality business, I guess. But well, the main conclusion is that you can live with a danger next to you. Another version of that, well, can it go by this? You also have to buy peace sometimes. There are a number of hospitality units where you pay for security guards who belong to private company. You also sometimes, unfortunately, have to do things that are not taught in schools and should not be anyway, because they are illegal, like doing everything you can to deter armed gangs to racket or go on racketing your own business. And so that means buying peace. So living dangerously and buying peace is the only ways to live next to a volcano. Now let's see where the volcano is. You have to identify zones of comfort. For example, you can have a Red Sea resort on the Egyptian side, and the Israeli side, and Jordanian side, without any problem. Whereas Egypt cannot send you to the Sinai, for example, because there are a lot of Bedouin gangs which operate there and are armed and sometimes indulge in terrorist acts. You can look also at a region in South Africa, and you may be advised to visit Cape Town by day. There is a curfew actually, and not Johannesburg, because even by day the crime rate might be too high for tourists. So that's one thing. The granular maps help you to understand when you can have your business during long period of times where conflicts are intractable and have little chance to be solved in the short run. Now, living with a volcano is exactly what one of the most touristic places in the world, the Bay of Naples, does actually, because here Naples is on the right of this map, so it's just the beginning of the metropolis of Naples on far on the right, top right corner. But in the vicinity of Naples, you have a number of very beautiful resort places. And as you see here, the yellow line is the line which defines the volcano, which is underground, under the sea for a part, and under the mountains on the other part. And people know that at any time it can just there can be an eruption which will be 10 times as deadly as Pompeii's was. So they live with that. I go there, I have fun there, I visit friends there, I go to hotels there, one of my favorite places in the world. But I mean, if I look at this map, I just will ban this from my future destination. But I've learned to live with sleeping volcanoes, because that's what makes people take some risk, chances to travel and visit other people, discover the world, etc. So what we have to do, of course, is we know that there are a number of sources of unpredictability, and so we have to make the world predictable to some extent, at least in the sectors and the parts of the map in which we are investing and in which we are living and working. So we stop at that point in order to have a discussion with you. And if you want to come back to points we already had addressed, that's not a problem. It's just up to you. Stuart?
Okay, and if anybody has any pressing questions, if they want to submit that in writing now, we'll maybe get round to it. We've only got one question at the moment. Maybe to touch upon something you've been involved with over the past weeks, which is preparing for that G7 meeting in Washington that you mentioned. How do you see growth going as we move forward in terms of economies? Is it going to be business as usual?
That's a very good question, because you see, the G7 has been established especially to tackle economic issues and respond to risks of recession and economic crisis. So the economy is the priority. Where time after time and summit after summit, I mean, a number of other priorities just came in, like terrorism, like intractable conflicts, like the the internet and privacy on the internet, and quite a number of other things have been addressed by this summit, depending on the current crisis. And of course, the Washington G7, the next G7 in Washington soon, is addressing the issue of the COVID-19 in priority. And so we all are concerned, especially those who are online today, with will globalization stop? Will it will be slowed down? What will happen actually? And of course, you have different ways to address this issue. But the G7, as far as I can know, because I'm now in the T7 think tank, preparing with a number of academics and people who are experts in think tanks worldwide. We're about 30. And for 4 years now, we do this. We prepare for the final draft, final resolution, which will be issued at the end of the summit itself between the heads of state and the government. So, in the meantime, there of course a process of a shuttle between us, the Sherpas, the advisors to the president and prime ministers, and these presidents and prime ministers themselves, and in the end you have the final resolution. Now, well, we have this COVID issue, and of course we have COVID-19 in every recommendation we made. But the idea is that this is going to make us change some of our ways to do and to think, but it's not going to stop the fluxes, mobility, exchanges, whatsoever. The idea is that we need to encourage people to do this on the basis of the highest quality possible and the highest consistency possible with principles or norms like more local, more sustainable, more politically correct, and more peaceful or less less conducive to even low intensity conflict. So basically, it's not completely business as usual, but the idea is that if you want to have business as usual, you should change a number of things and substitute quality, which is much more demanding actually for the business, to quality.
And it seems that
to quantity, sorry, quality to quantity.
And it seems that economists and governments have basically learned the lessons of the Great Depression, that you really need to almost spend your way out of this in the sort of Keynesian way, rather than kind of tightening the flow of money as happened after the great financial crash of 2008, 2009, where we had years of austerity.
It's exactly what we advise the heads of state and government to do, spending the money in some to support some economic agents and not the others. For example, they should invest, of course, massively in the health systems, in the green economy, and they should abandon a number of subsidies and grants, funds which accrue to activities belonging to the past, polluting more than others, etc. If you look at the oil sector, for example, it's absolutely nonsense to burn gas and oil and use it as a source of energy, whereas if you try to convert oil into very sophisticated plastics, then you can save lives in hospitals. So obviously, we should switch from very heavy fuels to light gas, which can be transformed into a number of sophisticated products and items needed to bring more welfare to the people. And also, you should decide that there are a number of products or services which should not be on the market. It's not, hospitals everywhere in the world should not be constrained by market rules. If you look at Germany, one of the reasons why the German system is resisting so well to the crisis, to the virus, is because they have quite a number of hospitals, private, public, semi-public, whatsoever in the Länder, and they had no time so far to rationalize this whole system as some other countries did, which means that they have an overcapacity in beds everywhere in the country. So they lose money for decades. But right now, it's a very good thing that they did this. They still have these clinics, local hospitals, medium-sized hospitals, and not only as probably in France and in Italy, for sure, and somewhat in Great Britain. I mean, very sophisticated hospitals in which the best physicians in the world, researchers, are operating day by day. So in the end, we need to take out of the market a number of activities. And even the Americans are prepared to do this. I was surprised because, you know, we were with, of course, a number of American experts who are having a conversation with the American Sherpa, the person who in Washington is member of the team of advisors coming from the G7 countries and the European Union, and who prepare this draft. And apparently the Americans are prepared to do something like this, provided Trump can get the credit for it. So now we go back to something that I'm going to address in the next session, undiplomatic Trump and twittering Trump. Well, if he can Twitter that it's a victory for him, and then this victory is actually doing exactly the contrary to what he pledged to his voters, which is more market, less subventions, less help for the poor whatsoever. But if he can get credit for something which at world level would help taking the health system out of the market rules, then he would do it.
But you know, in the States, we've had all the issues with Obamacare and so on, and I mean, it could be said that what the US lacks is a decent public health care system. That if you had the same sort of system that you have in Europe, people would have greater access to healthcare. And I mean, some of the stories are quite horrific. That you may end up with bills of say $75,000 if you get COVID-19, and who in the States is going to have that sort of money? So yeah, maybe more money needs to be put into public health care in most countries.
That's what we encourage for any country in the world, especially for those like the United States, where the public system is not as excellent as the National Health Service in Great Britain, for example. And I guess it's easier when you are part of a club like the G7 facing such a horrible crisis as the COVID-19 to completely change your position, and actually do exactly the contrary to what is what was in your program, electoral program. So I guess if Trump could easily word his statements and do things like what is this? Sorry about that. That Siri, you know, it's incredible. I mean, I switched off the sound, but Siri is still able to talk.
Well, that's why I've disabled Siri totally, but anyway.
Well, that's another possibility. Now, if you were Trump, you could not disable completely the private sector in health. But what you could do is to say that the Obamacare was a mess and that you do something much better for the public in public hospitals because of the crisis, and because now you got the support of China to do this as well, and they do it in China as well. So you are the initiator of a change in China. That's probably how he would try to make this volte-face acceptable to his partisans, I guess. So it's a possibility. I mean, what we are watching now is the crisis is so surprising in its consequences and the length of time, etc., that it makes people more able to, or more prepared to make big changes in their policy.
And I think we're also going to see some, well, strategic manufacturing move back to countries like the US, like the UK. Manufacturing has been outsourced for decades now to China, to low-cost destinations, locations. But I think we're going to see certain strategic sectors of manufacturing, such as for medical equipment, for PPE, for the personal protective gear, and so on, having to come back, even though it costs more initially. It would be shown to be an interesting and important move at this stage, so that you're not so dependent on having to ship products around the world and get the supply chains working in different countries.
Well, here there is another issue. If China, a very prominent country in the world and a rising state, a rising power, if China actually is in charge of producing quite a number of strategic goods which are used in health and even in the armies of the West, actually, like munitions, which are made in China, some of them. Okay, if China has the monopoly of some of these products, that's one aspect. Now, if it's Ethiopia plus Indonesia plus Cameroon plus South Africa, etc., plus Egypt, it's not the same issue. You see, you wouldn't expect Ethiopia to be able to put some pressure on consumers of health products that they would produce in Ethiopia than China. China, you can be just afraid by the size of the population. I think the first they have the priority is to go to help their own people, their own customers. Well, which wouldn't be the case with Ethiopia. It would be the case with a number of countries if the products which are less transformed industrially, less high-tech, will continue to be produced in zones which are outside the strategic leverage of most Western power, for example, or even Russia. So it's not the same issue. Actually, everyone will find its place in the division of labor at the global level. Ethiopia on the one hand, China, we continue probably to specialize in high quality product. And we will, of course, repatriate a number of production that are needed in case of emergency. We cannot wait for the Chinese to send us whatever we expect and need. And so the winner of this crisis is the notion of strategic stockpiling. That's the winner. I mean, we are all going to agree sooner or later, and probably sooner than later, on the idea that countries should be able to stockpile a number of strategic products. Where the list of this strategic product will be made within the WTO. That's the only place where you can do that.
Interesting, yeah, because the recommendation had been made to the UK government back in 2016 that it should start preparing for a pandemic, but somehow the recommendations were never carried out.
Same in France, same year.
Right.
Well, yes, there are also local causes for this mismanaging of a pandemic and lack of preparation for it. But first of all, the concept of taking out of whatever is ruled by the market, according to market prices, costs, etc., benefits, costs, mantra. Well, this is a new idea. We have this discussion since 2013 with the food strategic stock of India, and the drug stock also of South Africa and India as well. And now we have the discussion about number of health-related products, but that could also be for food, because there are people who are starving somewhere. And we need to have strategic stocks of food somewhere. So this notion is going to become more or less like a primary global public good. I mean, stockpiling a number of things, but what kind of things, at which conditions, and this should be endorsed by all the countries involved, meaning that you should go to a place like WTO to negotiate this.
Okay, well, maybe we'll wrap it up with the one question that came in from the live chat, which was from Carlo, who was asking whether we'll see business being conducted in a different way post-crisis, because people now are used to working remotely, using video and so on, working from home where possible, where they're not perhaps just sitting on the edge of the bed, but may have, you know, decent office space that they can work in. So do you think that we'll see more business being done via video and via technology rather than face-to-face, and that people don't have to travel around the world quite so often?
Well, obviously a number of opportunities which were considered as normal before the crisis will simply be discarded, and the meetings will be replaced by online meetings. But in the end, you will have face-to-face meetings as well. Now, about the way to do business, it also depends on the way people behave. For example, in Japan, you have open space rooms, but people speak very, they don't speak loudly. They do whatever they can not to embarrass the others. They are separated from each other by a number of things, and also because they are distanciating themselves from each other. That's within the culture. So in the end, you can have a very high building, high rise with a number of floors with the open spaces, and the COVID is not there. As you know, they only have 742 deaths in Japan. So that and they never stopped until 2 weeks or 3 weeks ago. They never stopped going to their business centers and the business towers that they have. So that's the problem. I mean, it depends on how you do business. But there are restaurants in which you are very comfortably sit, and you have room. Are not completely near neighbors who would speak loudly, sing, and expect saliva with probably a number of viruses, bacteria, or whatever. And there are others which are like bistro style, or type of places where you drink beer with others and you sing, etc. I mean, it's possible that the latter will be possible only in summer, outdoor, rather than all along the year and indoor, for example. Whereas the former type of activity, more exclusive possibly, and so more expensive certainly, will go on in big cities, in downtown, etc. That's one of the possibilities. There will be a reshuffling of the way we do business, but nothing is going to change from the bottom to the top.
So you're saying that it's still important to have those face-to-face meetings occasionally to build the relationships.
It's absolutely necessary.
Even if it's in a small yakitori place in Tokyo or somewhere that you know, it's got about 15 people and it crammed into a very small space. But,
yeah, very small space, which are, you know, they are clusters. They're separated from each other, so you have your own room most of the time. That's also a possibility.
Okay, so I think it's 1/4 past the hour. I think we'll wrap it up here. And thank you for an interesting session. And I think the next session is actually on Wednesday.
That's right.
Rather than Thursday. But anyway, same time, but Wednesday.
That's right.
Okay. Thanks a lot and take care.
Take care too.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.